Hey, Med.
Huh?
Are you bringing this up?
You want to bring it up?
No? Yes? So yeah. Oh, okay.
Mưa tập cuốn. It's been a long time, Tim. It's been a long time. Are you going to introduce the judges? Are you going to introduce the judges now? You are, right? No, okay. Okay. Jelas aja.
Alright, order. I call this house to order. I'd like to welcome everyone to the grand finals of in the finals. We have these members on the side government.
60.
And in opposition, we have Mara A.
Boom.
On the standards to goals, you say that going to judge speakers, if you need to leave the room, please leave your speeches. Yeah. On the motion that this House condemns medicalization, I now welcome the Prime Minister, Aditya Mitra.
The fact that tens and thousands of children with mild ADHD are often trapped in societal constructs of normalcy and pushed into long, mind-altering treatments by their parents at the cost of their lives is abhorrent. I'm going to bring you 4 arguments in first prop. Firstly, why we should principally condemn this medicalization. Secondly, incentives of pharma companies and doctors to push parents into these treatments. Thirdly, the harms of these children and why it's really bad. And fourthly, how this takes away from actual research of much riskier cures for other diseases and the incentives of shareholders in pharma companies. Brett's going to talk to you about how this otherizes people and imposes dangerous normative standards on being different and why that's particularly bad. First, why should we principally condemn this policy of medicalization in the first place? I think the only reason these things are problems in the first place are because pharma companies have invented and exaggerated these problems. And this is something that was there in the info slide as well. More often than not, these problems are not even close to as bad as they're made out to be. People with mild ADHD or hyperactivity can lead normal, meaningful lives if we just recognize the differences they have from us and try to accommodate those differences. They don't need long and arduous medical treatments and being dependent on drugs. We think that's a terrible thing to happen. When is something actually a problem? Because this is a very important question in this debate. When do we actually recognize a medical condition as a problem? When there's consensus in the scientific community that the condition has demonstrable harms and individuals cannot function without medical treatment, we think that's when the benchmark of a harm is crossed. We think, under our policy, we think that only if when all alternatives fail should parents ever look to treating their children with drugs and pharmaceuticals made by these companies. What do I mean? For example, children with mild ADHD often cannot cannot survive in the normal 6-hour school day that we have for other individuals. But they can do perfectly well in Montessori schools where they're taught using different methods of teaching. That's something we support. We support parents choosing alternative forms of treatment of these conditions which accommodate the differences for these individuals rather than pushing these children into drugs. Only if all methods fail should they even consider giving drugs to these individuals for curing them. That's the policy from our side of the house. The second argument, what are the incentives of pharma companies and doctors? And there are 3 points under this. Firstly, the fact that pharma companies are profit motivated means that there's a huge incentive to exaggerate the problems or the perception of problems in societies so they can create drugs and sell those drugs to millions of parents who are paranoid about their children. This is bad because pharma companies often do things like funding alarmist research or blow up the harms of these conditions and create negative connotations with these conditions through things like advertising or just telling doctors to tell parents of these children that these will be the consequences. There's a massive perverse incentive for pharma companies to push these negative incentives in society, negative connotations in society, and that's a bad thing. But secondly, pharma companies often lobby doctors, right? The fact that they want to maximize profit means that they often push doctors through paying them or other financial incentives to oversubscribe medication and overdiagnose these conditions. Like pharma companies have all incentives to tell doctors that you must try to prescribe as many drugs as you can to these children so that parents can cure these conditions. The third point under this is extremely important. Like, what is the role that doctors and parents have in these lives, of children? Because we think parents often don't have things like medical expertise and defer to doctors for advice on medical conditions. Parents often have the best interests of children at heart, i.e. they're often very paranoid about the conditions or the perceived conditions the doctors tell them that children have. They always want to play safe and always want to play safe in terms of curing these conditions, especially if the trusted person in their lives who they hold responsible for medical decisions tells them that these children have a condition. So parents are more likely to opt in to putting these children through these drug treatments, and pharma companies and doctors play into this paranoia. They fuel this paranoia because it's profitable for doctors and pharmaceutical companies. They fuel this paranoia because they know that parents don't know any better and often want the best for their child. That's terribly and principally condemnable and has massive harms on children. Before I go on, yes?
If your standard to allow whether or not this thing to be labeled as a disease and later to be cured, if there is a medical consensus that it should be cured, would you be okay with it?
Yes, if there is scientific consensus that individuals cannot ever live a life without this drug treatment, because even in ADHD, there are different scales of ADHD. So we are saying that if you have mild ADHD, we'd rather you send your child to different schools. We prefer the government funds things like different schooling or things like accommodative policies in education rather than funding research to cure these conditions and giving drugs to individuals. That's the standard that we're going to set. What are the harms in these children? And these harms are massive on these children. The first is societal perception and exclusion. And this is really important. You pass a normative judgment on excluding certain individuals as sick and diseased because they have different personality traits. We think that's a terrible thing to impose on these children. The fact that you have massive psychological harms on these children when they grow up in schools where they're labeled as different and abnormal and excluded from other children because the kids think that they are extremely different. The fact that they face bullying at school because you target them for these different characteristics and don't accommodate these policies in school or don't make accommodative policies which help these children. That's a bad thing. But the second and bigger harm is parents often push long and damaging treatments to achieve normalcy as dictated by society. The fact that parents often put these children on routines of mind-altering drug dependencies, which may cure the symptoms of their condition but debilitate them mentally from doing anything else. The fact that there's a never-ending cycle of new treatments being invented by pharma companies and pushed on to doctors. The fact that doctors continue to say that even if one symptom is gone, you must continue these drug treatments or your condition will reverse. The fact that pharma companies create new problems and say that we have a better drug to cure your children and make him better. It's a never-ending cycle where the paranoia of parents are fed and children are continually put on these mind-altering drugs, and that's a bad thing. But thirdly, you don't allow children to maximize their consumption of happiness, because we recognize that children are unconsenting individuals who often depend on their parents to make decisions for themselves. When parents themselves cannot make these decisions because the incentives or the influence in these parents have perverse incentives. The fact that the only people who can influence these parents have perverse incentives to change like the incentive of parents, children are often the one who often suffer. The fact that these children would have been perfectly okay going to a different school where their needs are accommodated and had a perfectly normal life and not been debilitated by drugs is a bad thing. My fourth argument, it takes away from research of risky cures. And this is very plain economics 101. There is a zero-sum game when it comes to investment, especially when shareholders of pharma companies have different options when putting in money to something. And every investment has a risk-return calculus where shareholders come in and say, I'm going to invest in this drug because it has this much risk of being successful, and we're going to make this much money on it. Now that pharma companies have an ability to magically create conditions and make cures for those conditions, there's an incentive for shareholders to only opt into these things. Because it's a low-risk project, because you can fuel paranoia of parents, and you can sell your medicines to millions and millions of people by having links with doctors. The fact that it's a zero-sum game means that shareholders of these companies are no longer incentivized to cure risky things, or actually cure conditions which are actually harmful to individuals, because there's an opportunity cost of doing this, because if you invest in something, curing a very risky form of cancer, which may fail, and you may not be able to make money off it. The fact that you can almost surely make money of a condition that you invent means that it distorts the calculus of investment of shareholders in these corporations, and the free market can no longer allocate resources efficiently to curing the most important diseases. Because it has massive harms in children, and because of the fact that it's principally condemnable, I'm extremely proud to propose.
Thank the Prime Minister for his speech. Now I welcome the Leader of Opposition, Ms. Amelia.
Was it 2 minutes or 1 minute? Do we need mic?
I can. Yeah. I'll just put it a bit far. The mic doesn't like Aditya. Can start now. Can start. Madam Chair, the stance coming from side opposition is this. We believe that there is an imperative and a duty to attempt to improve weak human conditions under status quo, because we believe that it improves the general quality of life of individuals, and we believe that it is the more human and moral thing to do, recognizing that certain human conditions are weak and it makes us weaker individuals. What do we support coming from side opposition? Number one, we support that pharmaceutical companies have a duty of care to ensure that they deliver good things, i.e. if they deliver things that are obviously harmful to people, we have laws against negligence to stop them from doing this. We also support things like regulation by FDA before they put out some drugs, Mr. Speaker. So this is a counterbalance to all of the harms that they talk about under their proposal, because they only wanted to talk about things like, oh, they magically come out with drugs that are harmful to kids and things like that. We don't think that context is real to begin with. They needed to talk about a more realistic context. I'll be talking about two things in my speech today. Number one, I'll tell you why should we attempt to correct weak human conditions, and secondly, why pharmaceutical companies should exaggerate the harms of these human conditions. I'll tell you the benefits thereof. Before that, couple of rebuttals. Number one, Aditya told you that these people can live a normal life and that's about it. We do not believe that that's a benefit, Madam Chair, because if you talk about kids who have ADHD or kids who are hyperactive, they do not live a normal life. They have added challenges as a kid, Madam Chair. They go to class, they cannot focus as much as other kids. They have learning difficulties and things like that. We think that a normal life that Aditya was talking about is non-existent. But even if giving them the benefit of the doubt that it does exist, we think that there is an imperative on our side to improve that quality of life, but by tackling these weak human conditions, and that is what I will prove in my first substantive. Then Aditya made a concession. He told you he's okay with recognizing these weak conditions if there is medical consensus. We think this is a concession, Mr. Speaker, because under status quo, for a pharmaceutical company to treat ADHD, their drugs need to be supported by medical research and things like that. So we think that the consensus that they're talking about already exists under the proposal. We don't know what kind of backing they're talking about. Thirdly, they told you that pharmaceutical companies or these drug companies are profit oriented. So therefore, doctors will be making manufactured will be imposing these choices onto parents because they want to make profit as well. Number one, doctors are not directly linked to pharmaceutical companies. They do not have any incentive to push for certain drugs to be continuously be sold, Mr. Speaker. So we think that the profit-making nature of doctors is independent of these drug companies. We don't think they're interrelated. Even if one or two doctors might be related to these drug companies, we don't think that harm is exacerbated under their side. We also believe that, Mr. Speaker, his whole investment or shareholder argument will be directly negated by my second argument. But before I move on, I'll take Tim.
Yeah, so there's a difference between a medical consensus and pharmaceutical exaggerating the situation. If it is as bad as you say, it's the status quo, why is there a need for pharmaceuticals to exaggerate the harm?
Yes, my point is, before they exaggerate, they needed a backing of a research first, and that is already in existence. And Aditya, your first speaker, consider that if you have that, you're okay with it. So what's your principle? Number one, why should we attempt to correct weak human conditions? You need to acknowledge the nature of human beings, Madam Chair. We are born with inherent flaws by virtue of us being human beings. Though human beings are not homogenized, we are unique and different from one another, but we think that there are common human conditions that are the same. Majority of individuals have the same weaknesses, Madam Chair, and this proves the necessity of our proposal. So what common human conditions can we attempt to improve? For example, things like having emotions or too much emotions when you're sad or when you're depressed, Madam Chair. When you're faced with dire circumstances like death, losses, and extreme disappointments in life. Also, things weak human conditions like fickle and irrational-minded individuals, and also children who are hyperactive and things like that. These are weak human conditions, Madam Chair, and it is in the best interest of humanity to try to improve it. Why? Because we think that these human conditions are harmful to begin with. Because when people are extremely sad, the myriad of harms that come later on is something that the state cannot bear. When people are extremely sad or extremely depressed, they become suicidal, they become unproductive members of society, Madam Chair. When kids are hyperactive, they get too excited, they drain out their energy, they cannot focus in class, they cannot, they cannot perform in terms of education and things like that. These are harms, they are inherent and massive under status quo, and state will have to bear these harms if we don't try to improve these flaws, Madam Chair. So why should we characterize these things as disease then? Because we think that, Madam Chair, the branding or the label will help people internalize that this is a form of treatment. We also want people to take it seriously. That's why we want to brand it as a disease, because we want people to think that it is mandatory for you to try to improve this human condition, and it is not supplementary. Because we don't want the people to treat these weaknesses as like taking vitamins. You can take it if you want, you don't have to take it if you don't. We think that we want people to take it. That is why we brand it as a disease, so that people will internalize the idea that they have to take this cure and improve their quality of life. Even if they don't want to make that decision, the state helps them make that decision and take that cure and be better member of society. The benefits that we get under our proposal is massive, Madam Chair. Number one, we help human beings become better. We become stronger in terms of dealing with our emotions. In terms of dealing with our emotions, we become less suicidal, we take tranquilizers and things like that, Madam Chair. It also reduces human error, because if you look at other industry, when you look at, for example, the aviation industry or even the medical industry, people make human errors, and this is the only error that we cannot tackle under status quo. If our industry can help improve human error, Madam Chair, and help tackle these these weak human conditions, we think that this will generally improve quality of life, not just individuals, but also sectors like aviation and things like that. Madam Chair, lastly, why pharmaceutical companies should exaggerate the harms on this human condition? Number one, we think that exaggeration is good because it creates that awareness, Madam Chair. Because we think that a lot of people are indifferent about being weak, Madam Chair, and we want to change this mental calculus. But we think that exaggeration is good because the flip side is even more harmful. Why? Dilution of the harms is even worse. You telling people that being weak and okay is more harmful than telling them that being weak is bad, Madam Chair. And we think that society aren't like silly enough to just buy into all these things that pharmaceutical companies tell them. There are also things like self-medication. They can go on Google and get more information and to find out if drugs are really good for themselves. So we think that there are already internal check and balance there. But even if companies are profit-oriented, Madam Chair, we believe that this profit-oriented nature complements them because they want to work based on trust of their customer, and they want to work based on reputation. These are incentives that help pharmaceutical companies make the right decision, sell the right drugs, but at the same time help people make the right choices to be better human beings, and we achieve that.
Thank you for your opposition. And
Mr. Speaker, M's entire speech was premised on the idea that we need to fix weak individuals. If you have ADD, if you are mildly depressed, there is nothing wrong with you. Weakness is a subjective determination that she has made about idiosyncrasies and personality traits. Just because I don't want to sit through a 2-hour lecture and have somebody ram boring information down my throat, it does not make me a weak individual if I choose to opt out of that system and enter into a Montessori program, an art school, or something that's better suited to facilitating my self-actualization as an individual. They are going to be making normative judgments about what a strong person or a weak person is all up and down the bench. How dare they? What individual make a determination about another human being about whether they are strong, weak, healthy, or sad? Just because you sit in your room and write songs does not make you a weak person. In fact, it might make you a successful recording artist. We think that's a good thing on our side of the house. I have 3 points of rebuttal and then 3 substantive points. 3 points of rebuttal. M tells you that docs aren't linked to pharmaceutical companies. Factually untrue. The fact that pharmaceutical representatives regularly visit doctors and advertising their drugs and frequently engage in conversation speaks to the fact that that's just not true at all. Like, that's not true in any country I can imagine. Moreover, the fact that Pfizer, the most massive pharmaceutical company in the world, employs old doctors and tries to build repertoire with them speaks to the fact that there's an extraordinarily close relationship between the pharmaceutical company and doctors. If they want to deny that, they're living in a fantasy land. Sit down. Second point of rebuttal. She says data exists that can form medical consensus. Wrong. Data does not make normative judgments about who you are. Data might say that students who take dextroamphetamine, which is also known as Adderall, it's a very powerful stimulant, that's why it has amphetamine in the name. If you take a really powerful stimulant, it turns out your attention span is longer. No shit, Sherlock. Like, that doesn't take a tremendous amount of data to know that. What they can't prove, though, is that being able to sit through a 2-hour lecture is necessarily always a good thing. Like, there's no medical consensus that your ability to sit through lectures or your ability to, like, pay attention at work is medically unsound. Like, that's not true. So when they cite medical consensus, they're citing data. They're not citing whether the medical community has made that determination. Third point of rebuttal. She said that we can lessen suicide. Okay, there's a massive distinction between being suicidal and having mild forms of depression that may not require medication. The fact that exercise, better sleep, and changing mindfulness meditation, all of these things have been proven by data to be just as effective at treating mild to moderate depression as selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors such as Lexapro, right? Like, there's no reason why somebody with mild depression should be taking Lexapro feeling like there's something wrong with them that requires a pill. Very, very problematic. 3 substantive arguments. First, why does medicalization create harmful power asymmetries? When pharma companies exaggerate the harms of problems, which first of all is weird because if these problems are so bad and weakness is such a terrible thing, why do the pharma companies need to exaggerate them in the first place? The fact that the pharma companies are even engaging in exaggeration speaks to the profit motive that's driving that exaggeration. No. What happens is pharma companies now have a disproportionate amount of power in dictating what diseases actually are. So when you're actually coming to a medical consensus, when a company that has an interest in selling you a pill is involved in the discussion that establishes what medical science actually is, even if the world comes to a medical consensus that ADHD makes you weak, that medical consensus was informed by a dialogue wherein a pharmaceutical company had a massively disproportionate amount of negotiating power in promulgating beliefs about what makes you a weak individual. Not at this time. Non-persons, companies, corporations that have no interest in anything other than a profit ought not define the spectrum of normal personhood. This is pragmatically inappropriate, and that's all of Aditya's matter, which was largely ignored, and never touches stuff about how this creates bad incentives for shareholders to now invest in medication that could be more profitable, rather than actually treat people. Zero response, but it's philosophically wrong when the consensus is dictated. Second substantive point, how medicalization imposes inappropriate normative standards about personality. Look, like, medicalization in capitalist societies is like result of a historical artifact about what makes you a successful person. Like, Western liberal democracies perceive success as the ability to succeed in a market economy. This is an extraordinarily narrow view of success. Your ability to sit still and pay attention for long periods of time is only desirable if you truly value the ability to sit through boring accounting lectures and maybe go work for, like, a financial institution. But what about the student who wants to go to a Montessori school, who wants to be an artist, who wants to paint, who wants to dance? When students who have ADHD are told, you're weak, there's something wrong with you, the fact that you'd rather go dance than study for mathematics makes you a weak individual, that undermines the ability of individuals to actually pursue what is self-actualizing for them. Go ahead.
Your logic is that not being able to sit in a lecture is not a weakness because they can be songwriters. But if they cannot focus to be a songwriter, what's your benefit?
Okay. If an individual is so debilitated that even their conception of like what would make them self-actualize is called into question, then they can go get a pill. Your burden is to prove that medicalization is a necessary condition for that individual to self-actualize. We don't have to abolish like ADHD medication. That's not our burden in today's debate. Our burden in today's debate is to prove that the gross distortions created by pharmaceutical companies is harmful. Your burden in the debate is to prove that the massive distortions created by pharmaceutical companies somehow benefit them when pharmaceutical companies dictate what medical consensus actually needs. We think that society has a burden to meet individuals halfway. For example, we think Montessori schools, which were originally conceived to help students who couldn't actually focus in school, have been massively successful. A world of medicalization makes it more difficult to enroll in a Montessori school. I'm seeing confused faces. Montessori school is a school where you don't have formalized classes, and you engage with material on your own terms, and you're able to explore things in the way that you want to. It's very free-form, very new age, very fun. I went to a Montessori school, great stuff. Anyways, Montessori schools are sometimes seen as bizarre and outside the realm of normalcy, and parents are sometimes hesitant to take students who might benefit from Montessori school and put them in because they've been told their whole life their child is weak. When you buy into their conception of weakness and you tell parents, your child weak because they cannot sit through a lecture, why are you enrolling them in a Montessori school? They need to be taking amphetamines so that you're giving them speed and they can sit through a lecture. When opposition gets up here and tells you that a better world exists when children are taking speed than being enrolled in a Montessori school, we think that's massively problematic. What we have told you in today's debate is that you ostracize people that are diagnosed with personality disorders. Individuals who are extremely introverted are sometimes diagnosed with dissociative personality disorder and other personality disorders. I call into question the very concept of a personality disorder. Sounds a little bit sketchy to me in the first place, but even if you buy into the concept of a personality disorder, the term disorder ought not be dictated by an entity that has no interest in you but your pocketbook, is only concerned about profit, is a non-person, and convinces you that you're weak if you can't pay attention. We're extremely proud to propose.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. Now for the Deputy Leader of Opposition, May.
It's very intangible. Can I just not use the mic? What's that sound, huh? Huh? But what's that sound? It's annoying, huh? That's a disorder, by the way. Huh. I have two pieces of substantive in this debate. Number one, I'll argue the importance of medicalization with regards to moderating the perception of society in order to create sympathy to the child who are going through these disorders. Second, I'll talk about how it better empowers R&D and advancement in order for you to reach that medical consensus that they considered in their speech but never proved to you how is it better. So condemning will reduce the chances of you reaching that medical consensus with regards to dealing with these problems. Few rebuttals, Madam Speaker. Before that, let's be clear that the burden of that side is to prove that the harms of medicalization will materialize. Harms like, for example, dependency on drugs, parents subscribing to the drugs to put on their children, doctors falling to the lobby. These are harms, things that Pfizer or pharmaceutical companies would do, but how will necessarily that harms materialize? Because if you argue that children would necessarily depend on drugs, that's still dependent on the parents if they really want to subscribe. Some parents don't even want to subscribe or use drugs at all and don't even believe in drugs, for example, Madam Speaker. Or even some doctors, you are assuming, homogenizing all doctors will fall to the lobby of these pharmaceutical companies just because they use experienced doctors or like Pfizer, how they say, has good reputation. But all these things are dependent upon whether the child will subscribe, parents will subscribe, and doctors will subscribe to that reputation. So just because we list out all these harms, but without proving that it will materialize, that is the burden you have to take on this debate, Madam Speaker. Sure, we'll prove to you why growth exaggeration will be better, and that's exactly what M did for you, and I also proved in my speech. Before that, couple of rebuttals. Number one, reputation is done. The argument that came from Brett wasn't 3, Madam Speaker, there was only 1. He talked about attention and Montessori, whatever school that was about, but in the end it was about attention. But let's deal with attention. I'll tell you later what are real other disorders that you have to deal with. Attention, Madam Speaker, he told you, number 1, why attention isn't a problem. If I had to go sit a class and not being able to attend to that class, that means I will not be able to understand what the lecturer told you. But if he told you there is an alternative, like Montessori, or being able to go to a dance class, or being a songwriter. But all these things require you to be attentive to it anyway. Therefore, not being able to attend to all these classes, being in a Montessori school, will still be a problem. Therefore, that attention has to be cured. But they told you, Madam Speaker, that they're taking money out of these people by creating that there is an attention problem. But if the attention problem is real, that is real, Madam Speaker, because you are unable to pay full attention more than 2 hours. And if that drugs would lead you to an outcome that you'll be able to pay more attention, Madam Speaker, therefore we think that the outcome that the pharmaceutical companies, although it's based on making profit, is still good, because there is an outcome to it and you're able to cure that problem, even though you don't think it's a problem. But however, Madam Speaker, I'll engage a lot later on real disorders that you have to lose in this debate. Lastly, they told you that you create personality disorder, and it's harm because they set an arbitrary standard on what is normal, what is not normal. But then again, in status quo, there are so many things that are set arbitrarily by other things. Even when it comes to real sickness like dengue, for example, you're also setting an arbitrary standard on it, on what are the symptoms and what are the outcomes you go through and not take medicine, for example. So often there are a lot of things that are arbitrary. But what's more important, Madam Speaker, is about whether or not that outcome is good or is bad, regardless if you're setting an arbitrary standard. But if there is a need for you to be cured, and you will be able to cure that problem, Madam Speaker, we think that arbitrary standard isn't a problem state. That's one of my first argument, Madam Speaker, with regards to the purpose of medicalization to moderate perception. In status quo, Madam Speaker, they told you that let's look into a person who is sick. Like I said earlier, dengue, someone who is going through dengue. Is that person normal? We say that's abnormal because you're going through a sickness. And how do we treat this person? You take them to the hospital, or you got to take cure, for example. So putting a label on a person being abnormal, say dengue, is completely, it happens a lot in status quo. But when it comes to a disorder, let's go on to other disorders other than attention. For example, an OCD person, not OCD like me who want to make sure things are good as how I perceive it, but chronic OCD, for example, will close the door for 10 times, or wash your hands for so many times that you bled yourself, for example. These are real conditions that exist in status quo. The problem with society, should you don't treat this person as someone who needed to be cured, is that you are unable to moderate the perception. The perception that you create out of knowing that this person needed cure, Madam Speaker, is that you are able to create sympathy by society. Should you, in status quo, if someone is normal, therefore the expectation that you have to that child or that person who is going through an OCD is the same way as another person. You would look at a child who you deem as normal but is going through an OCD, that it's so weird that he is closing the door 10 times or ensuring that he locks the door. But the problem is when society knows that a cure is necessary, you are able to create sympathy so that they know that that person is different than you, they are going through a condition that is OCD, and therefore we have to understand and not put too much expectation on that person. That also includes the problem that I told you earlier, the sickness about attention. So if a lecturer knows that a student have attention problem, as opposed to just not dealing with that student, the lecturer would pay more attention as opposed to, expecting that student to be able to give as much attention as other students who don't suffer ADHD. Therefore, it's very important for you to label, not leave that label, Madam Speaker, and that exaggeration and treating it as a sickness would necessarily mean that society will create a sympathy and therefore reduce expectation towards this child who are being bullied, for example, because bullying will be a lot more under that paradigm, because society don't seem to think that there is a lower expectation needed to be given on the child because he is normal, Madam Speaker, not to be treated. Before I move on to the second argument, I'll take.
Exaggeration by pharma companies and doctors, you're feeding the paranoia of parents and you drop off your statue.
No, the exaggeration that they took upon themselves isn't a lie, but it's a matter of the exaggeration on the outcome, that if you are ADHD, you will lead to not being able to give attention. But then the assessment would be, should it be a self-fulfilling prophecy? As in, if you are ADHD, therefore that means necessarily you will not be able to attend to that problem, or will you be able to want to mitigate the problem a lot more? We think you are more likely wanting to mitigate the problem, because when you realize that exaggeration would mean that this is the outcome, therefore you want to reduce the probability of that outcome happening, therefore you will deal with that problem. Therefore exaggeration is very important with regards to the outcome. Second argument in terms of R&D and advancement. They consider that medical consensus should it materialize, therefore they are okay with it. But how will you be able to reach medical consensus if there is no exaggeration? And we think exaggeration with regards to the outcome would only mean that there is more demand in order to deal with this problem. And should you have more demand, Madam Speaker, also dealing with the argument and told you that you will reduce investment onto people, because the moment you focus too much on all these conditions, you will reduce investment on real sickness like cancer. We disagree. We think those things are not mutually exclusive. But one more important, Madam Speaker, is in terms of people knowing and creating that awareness. The awareness argument that M argued was never negated by Brett. She told you that it's about time that you create that awareness. And the only way that you can create or reach out to the medical consensus is through the awareness that people have. The moment people are aware that these conditions are indeed a problem and create more demand, with these drugs, therefore investment, have more money to invest. And later on, the ultimate objective will be to solve that problem and to not allow it to happen anymore through the drugs that we have, or even not just from pharmaceutical companies, but also through doctors and healthcare system, Madam Speaker. Let's concede, Madam Speaker, in the end, this debate is not whether or not you should put that label on this case, or is it okay for you to exaggerate. We think exaggeration is important for you to reach a medical consensus. It's very important for you to create awareness. It's very important for you to moderate the perception of society and to create sympathy. For those reasons, we oppose.
Now for the government.
If there was any case of dropping the ball, that was it. We don't know what they want to defend. First, they tell us the conditions are generally bad, where people just cannot, yes, it is a shame. People cannot generally focus in class, and therefore there is a legitimate problem where there is a medical consensus that these problems need to be treated. But at the same time, there is also an inherent need to exaggerate the harms in order for people to take it seriously. We would suggest that the definition of diseases on this side of the house has been very clear. So long and so forth, there's a debilitating factor about you that debilitates your ability to actualize in the manner in which you want to do so, then we think it should be called a disease. Got a couple of things to talk about, and the first thing I want to talk about is the standards in which they've employed. Firstly, from M, they tell us that various emotions are generally bad. If you feel sad all the time, or if you're generally hyperactive, that's a problem. The problem with basing the premise of the entire case based on those two examples alone creates a couple of problems. Number one, there is no stop to the kind of over-dependency you create for parents who have these types of children who generally are involved in a lot of sadness or a lot of hyperactivity. Secondly, it is a never-ending cycle of subscription to various types of medication, especially if you employ the standards that a disease, no, saying my full name won't make me take you, sit down. That the over-dependency that you create by telling people that we need to call it a disease in order for people to subscribe to these types of medication. We think that is the kind of fallacy and a never-ending cycle that you create on that end. But thirdly, we think that this is a problematic yardstick when you can't differentiate what exactly is or isn't a problem. We've told you explicitly that the condition needs to be so damaging that there's an inability for the person to function on his terms. What does that mean? There is an absence of exaggeration on our part where there is a fundamental need for this person to seek help. Therefore, we think there's no label needed for a disease. But let's look at their yardstick in terms of how they wanted to label a disease. They said, we need to call it a disease in order for people to subscribe to it. No. We think a disease should be only called disease as insofar as it creates tangible harm to an individual, and that's a yardstick we're willing to stand by. Secondly is the concept of normalcy. We told you that you set a normative standard of what society needs to subscribe to. The problem with setting this type of normative standard, firstly, it's premised upon an exaggeration, that an artificial harm that isn't really that bad because of the absence of the kind of medical consensus there is. If there was a medical consensus, guys, you wouldn't need to exaggerate the harms in the first place. But secondly, you also premise these normative standards on perverse incentives that are created by pharmaceutical companies for profit intention, something that never was never dealt with throughout the bench. In order to create whatever normative standards, they keep saying that you need to be normal, the need or the necessity of this is premised upon what pharma companies decide to dictate of what is important and what isn't. And we think that is the perverse incentive. So even if you want to create a concept of normalcy under their end, which we generally disagree with, it's premised around the wrong function. But thirdly, we want to talk about how do we generally react. We've explained to you that the nature of parents is generally this. they will always want to play it safe. There will always be a tendency to believe your doctors and the medical institution because they are the ones who are generally qualified and have this experience at hand. Therefore, firstly, it creates a high susceptibility to believe these doctors under all instances. So any form of exaggeration that you're willing to stand by distorts the structural integrity that these medical institutions have in the first place, because you're preying on the desperation of these parents who think that their children have a problem because it's been deemed a disease by the artificial standards that they want to create. But secondly, we think pharmaceutical companies now have the unlimited power to blow up these types of problems and conditions because they're profit motivated. If I label something a disease and I know people will generally subscribe to it, that's a shitload amount of money that I can accrue for myself. If you base it on these forms of standards, we think you create that artificial paranoia where parents will feel the need to always subscribe to these types of medication because there's something wrong with my child. And that is the problem with that definition. We think so long and so forth is, even if a child is generally hyperactive or has ADHD, if he can function in the terms that he's set for himself and he is fine in the conditions in which he's set for himself, we will not call it a disease. We don't think there is a problem.
Exaggeration happens when pharmaceutical companies sell other drugs because they're always profit oriented. Why are you okay with exaggerations of other drugs, but not okay with exaggerations of drugs that help them become stronger individuals?
You know, the problem is when you phrase the question, why are you okay with exaggeration of other drugs, it's premised upon us saying it first. We did it, right? We're not fine with any forms of exaggeration of any forms of drugs, so long and so forth that it hasn't proven its efficacy in the debate first. So we never said it. Don't put words in my mouth. I take offense to that. Firstly, let's look at the things Matt said. His only parallel was to dengue. Okay, one, if you use dengue as a primary example, it causes physical harm that has imminent problems that you can lead to death. Sit down. But secondly, the way we solve dengue is to just repeat the pellets in your body. It is known. There's no exaggeration here. For you to win this case, you need to draw precedences or parallel examples of when exaggeration of harms have actually led to beneficial outcomes for problems that are legitimate in the first place. And they don't have that to begin with. But secondly, this idea of sympathy. The concept of sympathy that you want to establish here is preconditioned that the child is lesser off than everyone else. Yes, he may be hyperactive. Yes, he may be in a sad situation more often than not. But when you exaggerate the situation, the sympathy is far greater. This is unfair to people or groups of parents who don't want to subscribe to this medication because they think their child is okay. This is unfair to groups of children that are continuously being told that you are just like every other child, but somehow they want to create this artificial sympathy for that particular child. But here's the question. If pharmaceuticals were to exaggerate the harms by creating these types of medication, why would you want to create the idea of sympathy in the first place? It's a bit counterintuitive to create a situation where we are generally sympathetic to children that have these types of diseases and want to cure it as well. And we think that is the fallacy on that side. But secondly, how do you create a medical consensus without exaggeration? Or is there a need to create a medical exaggeration without consensus? Number one, we think the absence of a medical consensus shows that there is inconclusive evidence in the first place to establish any form of problems to begin with. Given that there is no medical consensus in the beginning, we don't think it's fair for pharmaceutical companies to run roughshod with this, to make as much money as possible on a perceived harm for children that are generally being told that they're either like the next kid next door, or there's nothing wrong with them, or they're just being different. The problem here with the side opposition is this. We don't see a problem with these children. But even if there are problems with these children, it cannot be exaggerated to the point where you want to create artificial sympathy that is premised upon pharmaceutical companies making billions of dollars for something that might not even be a problem in the first place. We're very proud to propose.
Thank you very much for the speech. Now welcome Jasmine.
Mr. Speaker, just because there's absence of physical harm doesn't mean this condition isn't something real. It doesn't mean they don't suffer. It doesn't mean it's something that we don't take seriously. Telling someone that something is an illness doesn't necessarily mean we attach negative connotation to it. We think that's a running assumption on side government that just because we say it's an illness, we say things that if you can't concentrate in class, therefore you're not a good student. We see no link whatsoever and no claims of pharma company that suddenly come up to you and tell you that people who can't concentrate in class are people that aren't good in society. We think they miss a huge amount of link. Right? So now let's really talk about the debate and what this debate really is about, right? What really is exaggeration? Exaggeration is not lying. It's also not telling you messages like, if a person is unable to concentrate in class, therefore he should be forced to concentrate in class or things like that. It's not that. And it's not also creating a social stigma that people must inherently be a normal human being or things like that. What exaggerating really is telling people that there's an importance to a certain condition, that a certain condition requires accommodation, that it's something to be taken seriously. So it's about children who are unable to concentrate in class. You tell them that it's not their fault, that there's a reason why they're unable to concentrate in class. We need to concede to a certain extent that they're not normal, that they don't go through life the same way we do, but there's a reason for that. And a pharmaceutical company tells you that there's a reason for that and we can help you. We think that's a characterization they miss. Sit down, right? So then another problematic thing from their stance was that they only wanted to defend it at the start of their speech, at the start of the debate, only people who are mildly depressed and only people who have mild ADHD or things like that. They refuse to recognize the benefits of medicalization, yet they want to assume the benefits of medicalization for people who have extreme or severe depression and people who have extreme and severe ADHD. We think there's a huge shift of case of coming on their side, and they're very principally inconsistent with what they want. Extremely soft case. Sit down, everyone. Now let's talk about the another lie that they talked about. They talked about another lie that they said was that pharmaceutical companies can arbitrarily decide what is a condition and what is not, what is an illness and what is not. That's a huge lie because medical communities have certain standards that people must abide to. Claiming something that the medical community does not approve is illegal. So a pharmaceutical company cannot invent a condition and then say that without the backing of a medical community. A huge lie. Sit down. So it's not just simple data. Medical community also decide things like whether or not a person who is extremely depressed or a person who is mildly depressed, which one of them should have which dosage of antidepressants. So you cannot administer, people from the medical community also decides things like you cannot immediately administer antidepressants to people who are only mildly depressed. We think there's also a standard in which a medical community set that the pharmaceutical company must have. So let's talk about another check and balance that they refuse to deal with, which is psychiatrists, the barrier in which people receive those drugs to begin with. We think the ultimate power of people deciding whether or not they get those drugs are still psychiatrists, who are people who are reasonable enough to assess whether or not those people really need those drugs, whether or not these people will be ultimately dependent on those drugs. They need to tell us why those psychiatrists are unable or will definitely be influenced by the pharmaceutical companies at the end of the day, and there's a huge assumption on the psychiatrists to always favor pharmaceutical companies. We think that's extremely self-incriminating. Sit down. So now let's also talk about things, but the conclusion to the argument is psychiatrists are people who have the last say in this. Therefore, pharmaceutical companies do not have the ultimate control of whether or not you're over-dependent on a certain drug or whether or not you're not dependent on a certain drug. Sit down. Now let's talk about stigma. Whether or not stigma is something created by the pharmaceutical company or created by society. Because those people are people who are mildly depressed or people with severe OCD are unable to react similar to us, to normal conditions in society. So these people are people that, examples that Matt talked about, people with severe OCD are people that have to open or close the door 10 times in order to feel satisfied that the door is closed. This is something Matt personally relates to, right? So we think that's an example that he already talked about. Now this stigma comes from their own personality and how society sees them. So the stigma is self-created by society. How pharmaceutical companies' exaggeration actually help the stigma is that they realize that this is an important condition, and the reason for them acting that way is not necessarily their fault. So the stigma that the pharmaceutical company necessarily creates is that it's a serious problem. It's not their fault that they are acting that way. Yes.
Okay, the Oxford English Dictionary defines exaggerate as, quote, make a claim that is beyond the bounds of truth. Can you please provide an example where a pharmaceutical company would exaggerate but not actually lie?
Sit down. Wow, Oxford Dictionary. Okay, never mind. But really, aren't you going to law school, Brad? They can't legally make that claim when it's a lie. Pharmaceutical companies are held to a higher degree of truth. So you're unable to make claims or unable to make lies when you don't have legal backing. That's illegal, Brad. So they're extremely unrealistic in most of their points. And half of Brett's speech is assuming what we wanted and assuming that we wanted them to be branded as people who are not normal and things like that. Extremely fluffy, right? So what is the actual burden in this debate? The actual burden is to assess medicalization and the benefits and harm that it has, right? Under their side, they want to defend certain benefits that medicalization has. The only thing they don't want to defend is when people who have mild condition subscribe to those things. We already told you there are check and balances to make sure people that shouldn't have that drugs won't have that drugs, right? They also only wanted to defend things like stigma created by the pharmaceutical companies that weren't actually created by pharmaceutical companies, that were actually created by society itself. They never fulfilled any of their burdens beyond just lying, right? So under our side, what we have told you was that pharmaceutical companies and this medicalization was what created awareness that this illness is something to be taken seriously. All those modules of people going through separate classes and having separate teachers and things like that to acknowledge that ADHD students are indeed people who are different were formed after medicalization, when people started taking this illness seriously. So this is a real condition that we need to acknowledge, and to a certain extent, medicine helped them. Why do we deny them that choice? We're proud to oppose it.
Thank you, Dr. Speaker. And now for the next.
Madam Chair, there are two elements in this debate, and I will show you how side opposition has established both elements. Number one, why should we attempt to correct weak conditions? And secondly, why exaggeration is good. Number one, why should we attempt to correct weak human conditions? I told you in my earlier analysis that some human conditions are inherently flawed. It makes us weaker individuals. And I told you, for example, extremely depressed individuals are less productive and they become a lot more suicidal. Then this is the rebuttal that came from this side. They told you it's okay because self-actualization happens when you grow up according to your own terms. Well, they told you if people want to self-actualize in any way that they want, that's perfectly legitimate. We disagree. We think that if people want to self-actualize by committing suicide because it makes them happy, provided that in this context we can provide antidepressants that help them improve their quality of life, we think that the right decision lies on our side. We think that there are some decisions, there are some conditions that is just not right, and we recognize, and we do not recognize these self-actualization as a benefit on their side. For example, we also told you that human conditions who are more prone to making bad choices or be weaker in the future is something that we would like to correct because it makes us a more dominant person. And then we told you this example about ADHD. They assume that everyone with ADHD want to be songwriters. But what if they want to be doctors and want to sit in lectures but couldn't, Madam Chair? This is where our drugs will help these individuals. They assume that these individuals do not have the capability to listen to these lectures and self-actualize and be doctors like you and I because they have to be songwriters. We reject that. Second, we told you why exaggeration is a good thing. They told you that we didn't explain. Just because you didn't rebut doesn't mean that we did not explain. We told you 3 things why exaggeration is good. Number 1, I told you in my earlier speech that it creates awareness. This awareness is important, Mr. Speaker, because parents, if you do not create this exaggeration, they do not feel the urgency to help their kids, Mr. Speaker. Our exaggeration make them realize and have this discourse with their kids. For example, they read about ADHD, they look at this exaggeration by pharmaceutical companies, they go to school and ask, is my son facing this difficulty in class? Son, are you okay in class? This discussion will help them make that decision because parents are not always stupid. They act in the best interest of their children. We create that awareness. Second, we also talk about sympathy, Mr. Speaker. We will be better able to cater to their need because our exaggeration tells society that this individual needed to be helped, and this helps them self-actualize better because we provide them with the support structure that they need and do not assume that they're fully capable like you and I. Thirdly, we also told you it improves outcome, Mr. Speaker, because the chance of improving the quality of life of this individual is higher on our side, and this outcome is something that justify why this exaggeration is good. But Brad then told you that he consulted the Oxford Dictionary, and the Oxford Dictionary told him that exaggeration includes lying. Is this true? No, I told you in my setup, Mr. Speaker, that number 1, these pharmaceutical companies already have the duty of care. They cannot be negligent because or else they will be liable to suing and things like that. Secondly, these drugs are not harmful because they're subjected to FDA approval before they can sell it, Mr. Speaker. This tells you that before you send your drugs to get the FDA approval, there needed to be some form of research. And these are medical research that back this FDA approval. So the fact that these medicines are now out shows that they get that FDA approval and it has that medical consensus that they're talking about. And lastly, we told you that lying is a crime. That is why they won't do it, Mr. Speaker. We told you exaggeration might come in form of advertising and things like that, and we're okay with it because of the benefits that we talked about earlier on. They told you that the nature of these companies being profit-oriented is bad. But I told you in my speech that because they're profit-oriented, it complements their role to provide drugs and treatments to individuals. Why? Because people trust drug companies and they work based on reputation. They wouldn't want to harm this trust and harm this reputation just to make profit. They would have to create that balance. That's why we think that their harms are also mitigated on our side. Look, Madam Chair, this debate is simple. It's about recognizing that there are some inherent flaws within you and I. We would love to help you guys become better individuals, and there's nothing wrong with exaggeration if it helps you make the correct decision and be a better individual.
Mr. Speaker, Op couldn't beat us in this debate, so they invented a new one. I'm going to give you 2 reasons why they definitely lose this debate. Then I'll answer 2 questions that demonstrate why we definitely win this debate. First, let's talk about burdens. It was our burden to prove that medicalization is principally wrong and pragmatically harmful. It was not our burden to prove that individuals will never ever take medication to treat suicidal depression or severe hyperactivity. They criticize us for focusing on individuals who experience mild to moderate depression, but those are the individuals who are going to end up taking medication when they don't need it because they buy into the exaggerated claims from pharmaceutical companies. That was the debate, but they didn't want to have it. They wanted to place new burdens on us by telling us we'll never give somebody an SSRI if they're about to kill themselves. We never said that. That wasn't the debate. That wasn't the motion. Let's talk about their burden. Their burden was to prove that pharmaceutical companies need, or should, or are justified in, exaggerating the harms of certain personality traits. They said, well, they can't lie, because that's already dealt with, but I'll deal with that in a second. They can advertise. Advertising is not exaggeration. If the harms of ADD are so demonstrable and damaging, there'd be no need to exaggerate in the first place. The fact that these pharmaceutical companies are engaging in the act of exaggeration demonstrates that there's a profit motive that doesn't exist absent that exaggeration. The second reason they lose is they ignored us. I'm going to go through a list of all the things they ignored. First, in my speech, the disproportionate bargaining power about what informs medical consensus is dictated by pharmaceutical companies that seek profit. So when M gets up here and says, the FDA approves it, oh, it's okay. No, because the FDA's approval is a part of the informed medical consensus that's dictated by pharmaceutical companies. Like, that's how it works. They completely ignored my speech, didn't respond. The second thing they ignored, doctors make money off selling drugs and there's a close relationship. They just denied the relationship existed. And then when I brought it up again in my speech, there was no response. I don't know if they don't understand it or they're lying. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt and say that they just don't know, but there is in fact a close relationship between doctors and pharmaceutical companies. It's well known, it's easy to look up, it's demonstrable. The third thing they ignored, that Uditya's point about how parents will push long-term and damaging treatments on children who can't consent to taking these drugs. Zero response. The fourth thing they didn't respond to is Aditya's final point about how you take away from research of risky cures because shareholders have a profit motive. And if shareholders can make more money by investing in a drug company that's going to exaggerate the harms of an invented illness and make a huge return on their profit, then what you do is you take money away from investment on real diseases and you pour them into fake diseases or things like ADHD. They never touched it. Maybe they didn't know how to respond to it. No response. Four things they never responded to. Why do we win? First question, do idiosyncrasies make you weak? Okay, before I do that, I gotta talk about this exaggeration thing. Okay. I am going to law school, so let's talk about the veracity of claims in a court of law. You can't prove a personality disorder because there's no objective standard for what makes a personality disorder, so no judge or jury is ever going to say you lied because there's no standard to evaluate the lie. So what you do is you invent a disease, you exaggerate the harms, that's what happens. Okay, do idiosyncrasies make you weak? Weakness is an adjective that is only descriptive insofar as it compares you to a normative standard. By telling parents your child is weak by not being able to sit still, exaggerating the medical harms of not being able to sit still, you make a normative judgment about what those idiosyncrasies are. But those idiosyncrasies, or what's a normal idiosyncrasy, should not be dictated by a profit-seeking company. This brings me to the second point. Must harms be exaggerated for people to take the disease seriously? So let's ask ourselves, why are the companies exaggerating these harms? Are pharmaceutical companies these benevolent entities that care about children, or do they want money? They're exaggerating the harms because they want money. It's not because they really care about the kids. So when you're evaluating this debate, you ought to take into consideration what motivates that exaggeration. They just asserted it's because the pharmaceutical companies care about the kids. No, they don't. They're accountable to their shareholders, not the kids. Doctors are accountable to kids. If someone is suicidal, we'll treat them. If someone's ADHD is so debilitating they legitimately can't function, we'll treat them. It wasn't our burden to prove that you shouldn't. It was our burden to prove that medicalization is wrong. We prove that, we win.